I have to say, first of all, that I have enormous respect for what is being done with this culture initiative. Somehow you have grabbed hold of what we have been struggling to put a box around in Europe. So what I thought I'd do this morning is give you a kind of overview of my life over the last 20, 30 years, being at the heart of some of the European initiatives, and I've been very privileged to work alongside some very effective policymakers and ministers during that period. I just wanted to get up about 50 times during those last 3 presentations and say, yeah, but that's absolutely right, but we did. And it's this kind of exchange which I really think this event is about. Well, the first thing I want to do is repeat Peter's slide, except spell the English properly, and say all the OECD countries except Japan, this is a very similar picture. We have the motorist and organisational problems which are absolutely key, and around about 2/3 of the deaths are outside the built-up areas, however you define them. When we have presentations worldwide, there is this puzzle about the poor US performance. How on earth can it be that the world's richest nation allows this scale of slaughter and puts itself alongside, well, it's not as good as Argentina, it's worse than Turkey. It looks absolutely crazy, I can tell you, when we put this chart up. Now, I actually, because of the RAP experience, can explain an awful lot of that, and indeed Nick's first slide did. It's about exposure. But if you tried that argument in Sweden, you'd be laughed off the stage, because they have some very severe exposure problems, which I'm going to talk a little bit about as we go on. Let's go back to 1980s Europe, when I was in charge. The UK was ascendant, everything was perfect, we were doing really well. And the truth is that there's 5 silver bullets that are in the WHO's guidelines on how to tackle these problems worldwide were really utterly defined during that evidence-based period. Seatbelts and helmets, alcohol, road safety engineering, vehicle safety engineering, excessive speed, deal with those 5, deal with the problem. And that's still very largely true today. The 3 E's became talked about all the time, and we did, certainly in Northern Europe, tackle the seatbelts and the drink problem, and I could talk to you about being at the heart of that and how it was done in breakout sessions. We didn't tackle the speed problem. This was the era of evidence-based policy, but believe me, this was not what was going on in countries like Spain and France and Italy and so forth. In the 1990s, there was a fundamental rethink about the fundamentals of what you're talking about, is how do we make travel on the road as safe as air and rail travel? How do we bring the same kind of cultural attitudes that we would to factory safety, about how do we just simply stop road deaths and bring them down, if not to zero, at least to the same level of risk as other risks we face in our daily lives. And this is where, as Mike said, that the Netherlands and Sweden really took the intellectual leadership with their Vision Zero and sustainable safety policies. The UK kind of ignored all this, being rather pragmatic. I mean, when you're top, you just carry on doing what you're doing, don't you? I mean, that's straightforward. So we have this interesting comparator of the UK versus the Netherlands and Sweden taking these rather more fundamental approaches. And the most fundamental thing, I think, was in the Swedish law of 1997, which is who is actually responsible for road deaths. Here in the US and in the UK, we still blame the victim. But actually, is the victim responsible? Is the designer of the system? What responsibility do they have, and who is the designer of the system? So I call this the I'm Spartacus effect, where we don't let Kirk Douglas take the rap. We all stand up and say, well, I'm responsible for a bit of this chaos. And we get this idea of shared responsibility emerging, where drivers, manufacturers and road operators all have to take a proactive responsibility for their element of the system. And in the Swedish law, the final responsibility is on the system designer. If there's still road deaths out there, the system designer has to change the rules or take some kind of initiative to stop it. Now, that's the theory, the fundo bit. In practice, you get these 3 areas of policy initiative. Euro NCAP, you have, I forget the name just for a moment in the States, but you had a crash test program for new vehicles, but Euro NCAP introduced a star rating system for new cars, which is spreading throughout the world. Euro RAP introduced a star rating system for roads. And then we get this new theme, came out of President Chirac, unbelievably, in France in 2003, this concept of road violence. We're absolutely intolerant in future of road violence. People who willfully drive in a violent way are as guilty as people who shoot people. And in the last decade, we've seen this enormous impact of the Europe-wide targets, the 50% casualty reduction target in the decade 2000 to 2010, which actually motivated many of the smaller countries and brought them into the net where people were actually monitoring their performance and asking the right questions. And their societies, particularly the newer members of the EU, responded very well to this. So we emerge with the safe system as being the new model of how we do things, that we have to look in a holistic way at road, vehicle and behaviour. In behaviour, we're talking about, back to those 5 bullets, sober belted drivers observing the speed limits. For the road, we're talking about self-explaining roads, which is the Dutch lead, and forgiving roads, which both the Dutch and Swedish have now adopted simultaneously. And the vehicle, we're talking about active and passive protection. Now, I'm going to try and show this crash. The drivers misread each other's intentions. The vehicle has no electronic stability control. The road has no safety barrier. So a complete failure of the safe system. So if I were Dutch, I would be talking to you now about building the layers of protection in everything that we do so that we stop the fatal outcome. A safe system is not just about speed, it's about managing energy. The human body can't survive an uncushioned impact of more than 25 miles an hour, so everything we do is about that. This isn't a Euro NCAP crash test. Notice we're crash testing the cars to resist the poles the road engineers have left behind, an example of thinking holistically. And it's not just about speed limits. This is the Swedish speed limit. If you have trees alongside a road, it doesn't matter really if you hit that tree at 100 kilometers per hour or 90 kilometers per hour, you're still pretty dead. And the truth is that many of our roads are simply unsafe at the speed limit. So unless we actually tackle the safety of the system, we're not going to attack the whole problem. And finally, the vehicle. Here is a 2-star car. The crumple zone doesn't work properly. The dummy inside is dead. And all around the world, the media come up to me and say, please, will you just say this into the cameras? What we need is 5-star drivers in 5-star cars on 5-star roads. And you can see here that we're constructing a model where no one is left off the hook. We can't just blame the victim. We have to interrogate more fatal crashes and why they happen. And in Sweden, and this is what I tell all the engineers, particularly the younger ones, we now know that 30% of the mileage in Sweden is carried out with sober drivers, belted, obeying the speed limits, in 5-star cars on 5-star roads, and we get 3% of the deaths. So I say to them, go out and build the safe system. It works. So let's deconstruct the system and see how we can actually achieve this. Well, culture does matter. I focus this around France because France is an extremely interesting country, and we've done some work recently comparing France with other neighbouring cultures. Here's the death rate, France roughly in the middle. The Belgians are amongst France's neighbours performing the worst, and the GB and Netherlands and neck trying to become the safest countries in the world. Speeding. Belgians, there you are, speed matters. Britain and the Netherlands a little bit better. Now look at alcohol. This is a real problem in Spain and France, but Britain and the Netherlands have just about, if you like, cracked it, although it constantly has to be refreshed. Here is a kind of apocryphal conversation. I was in a ski resort like this in France. I said, let's not go out of the village to eat tonight because I want to have a drink. And the guy who was French said to me, you don't have to worry, the police never come round these parts. And this actually summed it up. The British policing culture was all about developing the community policing each other. So it's unacceptable socially to drink and drive. You cannot do it with the kind of heavy-handed enforcement which the French are actually trying to pursue. That is my view. But things can be changed. The French were pretty awful at wearing seatbelts, but look, they're better than the Brits and the Dutch now. They really have cracked that one. They have done what we did in the 1980s, but rather better. The other thing you hear is, we just need courage. It just needs political leadership. Look at these facts. 85% of people support this, 85% of people support that. Peter hit it on the nail. There is a strong do as I say, not do as I do attitude out there. And particularly we found with the drink drive limit, which is the same as yours, that was a huge resistance moving from 80 to 50, which is the European norm. And it came from the rural areas and it came from the middle classes in the rural areas. I said there's a huge resistance. The newspaper, if you like, rural middle-aged male community was extremely upset by this, and they are a very powerful constituency. And they were easily able to play the good self, bad self in the campaigns that they were running. So even though 85% of people want the limit to be zero, you still get this huge resistance politically in Britain to changing the drink drive limit. And all this is about deconstructing what people really think, the values and beliefs that you've been talking about. And over the years, I've done dozens and dozens of surveys as an AA policy director, and I think I understand quite well what's going on. We made a real mess of speed in Britain, although it is working, because we simply got it communicated as a revenue-raising issue. We have 10,000 speed cameras. We have 10 speed cameras per 100,000 of population or something of that order. And the resistance was huge, simply because of very poor presentation after my guys had done the research saying there was latent support out there, but watch this, and watch this, and there was no watching of it at all. Creating demand for safe roads. Now, we have in Britain trialled and then run it out to Europe, a campaign for safe road design. Look at the difference here between Netherlands, Sweden and Britain in terms of asking the population, do you think safe roads are important? In the countries which are really running this hard, we get this 37% of the population understanding that safe roads are a key part of the safe system. But in Britain, the personal responsibility thing is top of mind. It's all still very much, it's only the driver. And in the safe system thing, as you'll see later, it's absolutely vital to get the road infrastructure right. And so all the professional institutions and road user organisations in Britain joined together to create this soft, gentle motherhood and apple pie campaign for safe road design, and get over that safer roads save lives and are much more important than people think. But it's a difficult act to pull, because you've got to get the personal responsibility message for your drivers over, but at the same time, if they think it's all their own fault, they don't ask for safe roads. And this is really the struggle that we're facing at the moment. Now, for those of you who are not engineers, let me just show 3 slides. People die on the roads in 4 very simple ways. Run off road and hit objects, head-on smashes, smashes at junctions, or you're hit as a pedestrian or a cyclist by a heavy vehicle. Implementing all these simple engineering measures has a phenomenal impact on the death rate on the road. Here from France, you see in an area of natural outstanding beauty how a good-looking safety fence has been put in. There you see the lattice posts that are spreading throughout Europe from the north, which collapse when you hit them. There's some motorcycle underrun protection and some classic safety fence at the side of the road. Safe junctions, the magic roundabout. France have put in 20,000 of these, still putting them in at a rate of 1,000 a year. The perfect energy management system. Vehicles are slowed as they come to the roundabout, they're turned, any impact becomes a glancing blow between vehicles going in roughly the same direction. As a director of roads in London and Scotland, I just couldn't believe that you could just wipe out deaths completely just by putting roundabouts in at junctions, and they're going in everywhere all over the world. And I think there's quite a program in the US that's beginning. But if you can't do that, at least on busy roads provide protected turning lanes. Now here's the one that's going to knock your socks off. It is no longer true that the safest roads in the world are freeways, motorways, autoroutes. This is the safest road type in the road, and in Sweden they put in 2,000 kilometres of this. Their target is to have the whole of the busy network, by which I mean over 3,500 vehicles a day, fitted like this by 2025, 75% of the network fitted like this by 2020. It is just a different road, isn't it? But that's why Sweden is the safest country for single carriageways by far, because we can now measure safety. We have this system throughout the world of risk mapping, which measures the safety of the system, the road, the vehicle, and the driver, using crash data and exposure rates, and we simply colour code this. And every year in Britain and all over Europe, when we publish this, the media is utterly full of it. Who's got the most dangerous road in the country, which is the most dangerous road in the region, which is the most dangerous road locally, and the media's cuttings are like this. And we're actually getting people to understand the safety of the road. But that's the system, because it involves the behavioural and the vehicle side. But we can also now have a similar system for star rating the actual road infrastructure. And this is what we do, particularly in developing countries, where crash data isn't available. And the obvious point is, where you're getting high crash rates, and when you're getting a black rating on your star rating, 1 or 2 stars, that is where you need to focus your action. We track improvement, been doing it for 10 years in Britain. We now have identified 50,000 kilometres, 10% of the network, where over half the deaths are taking place. And year by year, we track who has made the best improvement, who's got the roads that just need treatment and haven't succeeded, and we map the process in eliminating high-risk roads. We create this competition throughout Europe. Here is 15 countries. We published this a month ago with the Commissioner in Europe's support, and it shows again that Sweden has the most roads that meet the highest safety standards. 86% of their network are in the green safest category, whereas in Britain it's only 52%, and then we have real problems in Italy, Poland and Spain. What about organisation? Well, is Europe transparent and accountable? By and large, you can get the data extracted from most countries, and there's a huge list of 20 countries there where we've been successful in getting them to give to an independent NGO, somebody who's going to comment independently on performance, getting the data from them. But astonishingly, France, Germany and Norway, which is more a personal aberration of one roads director, but France and Germany institutionally seem capable of the idea of handing over the data for someone else to make independent comment, which is an interesting measurement of the transparency and accountability in Europe. Don't get me wrong, many of the engineers dislike this intensely because it allows a focus on their work which isn't altogether comfortable. But most of the bright ones really support it because they realise that unless the public has some interest in what they're doing, then the funds aren't going to flow to them. So they see us as friends and allies, even though every now and again we have to say some tough things about the performance. Finally, one quick word beyond the US and Europe. Let me just take you over the last 5 years in 5 seconds to where we are now. In 2005, the World Health Organization published a seminal report on global death and injury, which Mike mentioned. In 2006, one of the charities I'm involved in led the Make Roads Safe campaign to raise the issue globally. In 2008, we had the publication of the OECD report Towards Zero, which was an extremely important report. In 2009, we achieved the first ever interministerial conference on road safety, seen so important by the Russian government that the president himself addressed that conference, and the development banks recognized they were doing extremely poorly on an area, as Peter said, that is bleeding away 2% of global GDP. In March this year, the UN General Assembly declared a decade of action on road safety. And so in May 2011, we start a UN decade of action on road safety. This is an extraordinary global achievement to have got to this position, and now we're moving into the bite bums phase. We're going to ensure the decade is action, and things like the IRAP program, which are talking about eliminating high-risk roads from the world network, are absolutely at the heart of it. Thank you very much.